No bills have been introduced. 3 related issues arose in the House last Wednesday in relation to an oral question from the Honourable David Parker. The first issue is who questions are actually directed to. The next issue concerned how the government could be questioned about portfolios that no longer exist. The other matter was the extent to which a government of the day was answerable for the actions of previous governments. I will deal with the 3 matters in that order. Questions to ministers relate to a portfolio that a minister holds, not to an individual person. A question must relate to one portfolio and can only be directed to the minister about a matter for which he or she is currently responsible and not to a portfolio previously held. The exception is the Prime Minister, who is responsible for all activities of the government. Where a portfolio is defunct, there may be a minister in a related successor portfolio. In that case, a question should be directed to that minister. Ministers have a duty to the House to decide on the appropriate minister to answer a question and to direct the question to the minister who holds the portfolio more directly concerned with the subject matter of the question. And I refer you to Speaker's Ruling 167(1) to 167(5). It is for the government, not the Speaker, to determine which minister has portfolio responsibility for a question. Speaker's Ruling 1674. There will be some instances where there is no clear successor portfolio. The Prime Minister is the head of executive government and determines the title, scope and allocation of all ministerial portfolios. Cabinet Manual, page 18. The decision to create or to disestablish a portfolio belongs solely to the Prime Minister. Furthermore, the Prime Minister is the principal advisor to the Sovereign and has responsibility to the House for all activities of the government. It is permissible to ask the Prime Minister a question about any of the public affairs for which the government is officially connected. Speaker's rulings note that the ministerial responsibility of the Prime Minister in particular is a broad one. Speaker's Ruling 1734. Because the Prime Minister is the only one who can disestablish a ministerial portfolio, and because of his or her very wide sphere of ministerial responsibility, questions about a portfolio that no longer exists should be addressed to the Prime Minister where there is no successor portfolio. There are some limitations on the Prime Minister's responsibility for defunct portfolios. He or she is not responsible for previous administrations. That point leads to the final matter raised, the extent to which the government of the day is answerable for the actions of previous governments. The government is not considered by the House to be a single continuous entity. The defeat of a government in an election marks the end of one administration and the commencement of another, even though there may be a caretaker period. Ministers in the government of the day are not responsible for the activities of the previous administration. But in respect of the activities of the previous government that a minister has had to address as a member of the current government, it is legitimate for the member to comment on those, and I refer members to Speaker's Ruling 1741. A minister is never responsible for the policies or activities of the opposition, and so should not be asked about them or offer a view on them in the answers 1742 to 1744. 2 points of order were raised last Wednesday related to these matters, which I'd now like to address. Mr Brownlee took issue with the question referring to roles, quote, previously carried out for Honourable Murray McCully, close quote. Having reflected further on the matter, I believe that Mr Brownlee was correct to do so. The second part of the question brought in matters for which the Minister is no longer responsible. As I have ruled, a question must relate to a portfolio currently held by a Minister. Mr Hipkins then raised a question about whether a minister may be questioned about something that he or she became aware of when handling a previous portfolio. Having further considered that point, I agree with Mr Hipkins that a minister may be questioned about matters he or she became aware of prior to holding a current portfolio, provided the question asked is relevant to a portfolio currently held by that minister. I thank members for raising these matters, which have not been the subject of many previous Speaker's rulings.
Point of order, Mr Speaker.
Point of order, the Honourable David Parker.
Thank you for those rulings, sir. I accept them and I think they're wise guidance to the House. I have one further point of clarification, sir. I sought some advice from the Clerk of the House after the question time to which you referred, and he made the point, which isn't addressed in your ruling, that where the Prime Minister or indeed other ministers transfer a question, because I can see that if a question in this context was put to the Prime Minister, he may choose quite rightly to refer it to another minister, that the minister to whom the question should be referred is actually the minister with the most knowledge. And he thinks that that is implicit, or the impression I took was that that is implicit in Speaker's ruling 1675. And I think it would be helpful, sir, if you could clarify in these unusual situations where there is a transfer, actually in the end for the House to learn what it should, the person to whom the question should be transferred, if it is transferred, is the person who has the most knowledge about it.
I will look further at the matter, but I think that is well and truly covered in the ruling that I've just given, in that it is the duty of the government and the ministers to make sure that the question is directed to the minister with the most knowledge and most ability to answer that question. That is an expectation of this House.
Point of order.
Point of order, the Honourable Gerry Brownlee.
Mr Speaker, thank you for those rulings. I think they'll be very helpful moving forward. The one thing that I would ask perhaps for some further consideration on is what constitutes an administration in a continuing sense. In other words, if a government is elected in 1 year, goes through a 3-year term, is re-elected, does that continue to be the same administration? Because with the MMP environment, the make-up and nature of that can be quite different. And indeed, some policies that might have been promoted in a 3-year term, in a subsequent 3-year term with the majority of the government continuing, may in fact not be progressed or even overturned. So I think it does, under the MMP environment, raise a question about how long an administration should be considered in office.
The Honourable David Parker.
Thank you. Of course, that very issue arose in respect of the last Labor government, which for a subsequent term was questioned in respect of the actions of the Immigration Department and the prior Immigration Minister, Taito Philip-Field. And of course, the questions were perfectly in order in respect of the subsequent Parliament.
Point of order.
It is a relevant but slightly different point, and that relates to the answerability of ministers for the actions of previous governments, which doesn't seem to have been covered by the ruling that you have just made, and that the government of the day, whomever it is, continues to have accountability for decisions made by previous governments that they may not necessarily have been involved with, insofar as there is a continuing impact of those. And I think of things such as breaches of the Treaty of Waitangi, the abuse of children in the care of the state, those sorts of issues where there may not necessarily be, it may have been successive governments who had some responsibility. Someone still has to answer to the House for those types of issues, and it is the government of the day, whomever that is.
I think on Mr Hipkins' point, I've covered that point in detail in the ruling. On Mr Brownlee's point, in my mind, as I consider this ruling, an administration, for my mind, changed, for instance, at the end of 1999. It changed again at the end of 2008. If there was a substantial change in the formation of a coalition government, a substantial change that meant the overall direction and policies of a government changed, I could see that being considered as the end of administration. But in my mind, the current administration in government today applies since, I think it was November or October 2008. We move now to questions.